Welcome back into the Lions 24/7 podcast. I am Tyler Donahue. This is our third episode of this week. It's game week number 3. It's the 4th week of the season. Of course, Penn State had last Saturday off, but Kent State comes to town. If you listen to our last podcast, which dropped on Wednesday, you have a pretty good understanding of how much of a struggle it has been for the Golden Flashes, not just this year, but during the duration of this Kenny Burns coaching tenure, which goes back to the 2023 campaign. They're riding a 12-game losing streak to this campus. They're 1-14 overall against Burns, and they have not been competitive against Power 4 competition. They've also lost to an FCS school, St. Francis of Pennsylvania, just a couple of weeks ago on their home turf. To break down this matchup, but to talk a lot more about what we've learned about these Nittany Lions during the course of this week and coming off the practice field Wednesday, I welcome back Daniel Gallen and Mark Brennan, part of our crew at Lions247.com. Guys, turns out we have a lot more to discuss than just the game against its squad coming off a 71-0 loss at Tennessee. I'd encourage folks, if you want to learn more about the Kent State Golden Flashes, we got you covered in the last episode. We had one of their beat reporters join us and then have a nice 15-minute conversation about those struggles, but the players that could make some momentum for Kent State against Penn State. But guys, a lot has developed for the Nittany Lions, and that's going to be our central focus here. Mark, we got to begin with the obvious. KJ Winston ruled out long-term, according to James Franklin, when that topic came up following a Wednesday practice over at the Haluba Hall gathering that we get each Wednesday. Tough break. I mean, this is a situation where KJ Winston started the season as Big Ten Defensive Player of the Week, 12 tackles, 7 of them were solo. He had a fumble, a forced, and he's a guy that we've all pointed to as maybe he is the answer to the question of who will be that first defensive back selected in round 1 of the NFL draft, right? We don't know that it's a season-ending injury, but we do know that we're not going to see him on the field for Penn State in the short term, near term, and really we're talking about months when James Franklin's bringing up the long-term situation based on what we've gathered there. So, Mark, where do you kind of begin to pick up the pieces on the KJ Winston conversation?
Well, first you think about him, right? I mean, here's a guy who, as you mentioned, Tyler, I think we all think he has an opportunity to go very high in next year's draft. And hopefully for his sake, this doesn't kind of derail that. I mean, hopefully he's able to get back to where he needs to be. And he still could come back, I assume. So if he needs to, great. But my first thought is always with the kid. I mean, the program's one thing, but I think the program's ultimately going to be okay. But your heart goes out to him because you just see the level of talent. I mean, the size, the speed, the natural instincts, all of those things, the way he put it all together last season and was just looking at having a huge year this year. From Penn State's perspective on the field, I asked James Franklin about this. How fortunate are they that Zakee Wheatley really found his stride in the offseason? I mean, because here was a guy who, a couple years ago played a lot of football, actually saw his snaps decrease last season, and really emerged as the third starting safety this year, along with Jalen Reed and KJ Winston. So the fact that you have him playing at the level he's playing at is a very good thing. But now the question obviously goes to depth. You lose King Mack to Alabama. We weren't thinking that was going to be a big deal, but here we are, and they're going to have to depend on some very young players back there.
I think we thought losing King Mack would be a big deal in 2025 more than it would be in 2024. Daniel, just really quickly, so our audience, if they haven't caught the coverage or somehow this remains news to them on Thursday, we do not know the specifics of this injury. We typically don't when it comes to Penn State injuries. That's just the standard operating procedure from James Franklin and company. What we do know is that he exited during the second quarter of that game against Bowling Green a couple of weeks ago, and then he did not return. He remained on the field. He didn't have his helmet. He was on the sidelines. And then we did not see him at practice this past week, or I should say just yesterday. And it was the first question with Franklin, so we got some clarity there. Wanted to make sure that was out in the open, what we know and what we don't know. But Daniel, going beyond the physicality and the athleticism and the productivity that KJ Winston has brought to the field for Penn State, he was also an ingrained leader for this locker room. I mean, the way that Tom Allen described his presence couple different times during conversations this year as he's gotten to know KJ Winston, to me was remarkable and spoke volumes. It kind of provided a fresh perspective for us about KJ Winston. And for whatever reason, when there's been KJ Winston interview opportunities, you're the guy who's typically gone to him. So I'd like to hear from you from a personality, presence perspective. What are you most curious about coming away from this?
Yeah, I was going to say, selfishly, this is a pretty big blow for us because KJ Winston was probably one of the better interviews on the team, especially on that defense, which was undergoing a lot of transition this offseason. But in all of my dealings with Winston through the media, I mean, he was very thoughtful, very well spoken, made his points very clearly, and was really thoughtful. I think that's the one thing that stands out to you is when you ask a guy a question and you can, maybe they take a second, but you see the gears turning and they're actually putting some effort into it. That's what I thought, every time we talked to Winston. Franklin was asked about the intangible part of losing him, and Franklin made it clear that he's still going to be around. He'll still be active. I mean, we saw him on the sideline without his helmet, wasn't going to go back into the game, but he's still moving around. I think there was one play where he was talking to Drew Aller on the sideline after something happened on the field. And normally, you don't really see defenders and offensive players interact. I know that Winston wasn't playing, but that still stood out. And excuse me, I think that spoke a little bit to the standing that he has with this team. But I think that it's going to be interesting to see who the other voices are there. I think Jalen Reed is one that you're going to watch. Wasn't a team captain, but he was a game captain for week 1. He's one of the people that has been put out in front of us, going into some big moments. And I think he's someone who is really, really motivated coming into this year. You talk about KJ Winston's performance in week 1. I think you also have to talk about Jalen Reed's performance in week 1. Just really, really impressive at West Virginia. So I think that there's some, both from on field and off the field and in the locker room, I think this is just a really big blow for Penn State. And in both cases, it opens the door wide open for other guys to step up.
We'll get into those other guys, and there's a freshman that's kind of at the top of that list right now. But you brought up Jalen Reed, and he was fantastic in week 1. What was he doing in week 1? He was playing the line position. He was in the box. He was in the slot. What happened last time they were on the field? KJ Winston gets sidelined. Jalen Reed kind of returns back deep alongside Zacchaeus Wheatley. They're your safety tandem. You've got Cam Miller, who started the game on the perimeter, moving inside, playing that line role. We've seen him in the slot a bunch in the past, but he was there. That was kind of his home, where it was Jalen Reed's home in the past. And Mark, this was something that got brought up to James Franklin. I think you may have been the one who brought it up. In terms of the absence of KJ Winston, you're not just talking about the loss of an elite safety. You might be talking about the departure of an elite Lion, because Jalen Reed has proven a lot at the safety spot, but I think we all were viewing him as this Mr. Do-It-All, really weapon at the line spot. And so he's going to go back to safety, where you have a ton of trust in him. But now Cam Miller's a guy who, he's had his moments in a Penn State uniform, but he's also had spots where he's been, the guy who's getting targeted more than others during his Nittany Lions career. And right now it seems to be he's stepping up to the spotlight. And then Dejan Lane stepping up to the spotlight, the freshman safety, we've heard good things. We knew he was going to burn his red shirt, but now James Franklin making multiple points at various days this week and saying Dejan Lane is going to be a factor. He has to be a factor. We got to bring up the speed. And it sounds like, Mark, until Dejan Lane is starter ready, essentially, that Jalen Reed is that you're going to lose that flexibility, and he's going to really be back deep, which then lends you to wonder who else could be a factor at the line position. Zion Tracy got some work there, but there are ramifications in play here.
Well, yeah, and then the trickle down, right? I mean, we're not even talking about that, because when they're playing that Lion, they're going with 2 linebackers. And what's the other position where there's concerns about depth is linebacker. So you can't necessarily counter that with playing more linebackers.
And let me just say, Franklin did kind of give us that note too. He said that if Jalen Reed, who has the physicality in the box, if he's back deep, then they may have to look at going with that more traditional 3 linebacker set versus 12 personnel. And you're right, that strains a couple different positions now.
And that we're 2 weeks into the season. I mean, so, obviously we got some good news about Tamir Robinson, and I know we're going to get there, but I think that just makes his return that much more important because of the lack of depth they have at linebacker. But yeah, I mean, the thing that Franklin said that I kind of liked is that, and you touched on this, you hold out hope that later in the season, you're this early in the season, that Lane, and if Belgrave Shorter or any of the other guys end up, kind of being able to fill into that safety role, that you could move Jalen Reed back some point along the way. But for the near future, it's going to be you lost a key weapon at that Lion position, because we saw last year and we saw this year the way that Jalen Reed is comfortable, even though he wasn't necessarily playing that specific position throughout his career. He's been extremely comfortable back in coverage, up near the line of scrimmage. He could really play anywhere. And when Franklin talks about him, when anybody talks about him, they talk about his football IQ, and being able to move that player around is like having a key piece on a chessboard, and now you can't move him wherever you want.
Daniel, I'm glad that Mark referenced Belgrave Shorter, and there probably are some listeners out there who fall into a couple different categories. Either A, who is that, or B, I thought he was a cornerback. Antoine Belgrave Shorter and John Mitchell both came up from the same school in Jacksonville, Florida. January enrollees in the cornerback room. Belgrave Shorter has had a home there until this week, apparently, or maybe during that bye week. And James Franklin let us know, kind of went out of his way to make sure we were aware that Belgrave Shorter is going to be a guy who can maybe be a factor at safety. But he's just a freshman. And Daniel, Dejan Lane is the other freshman we've heard a ton about. There's Vabu Torre, who also came in with this class. Lamont Payne came in last year as a cornerback, ended up in the safety room in year 2. Colin Dinkins also transitioned from the cornerback room. He's a guy who had a lot of offseason buzz, but didn't necessarily sustain through preseason camp and into early season based on what we were hearing. He's been mentioned by coaches in the past as being a legitimate factor at the Lions spot. And then Tyrese Mills, who, if it's not happening for him now as a redshirt senior, considering what's going on at safety, I don't know when it will. So throwing a lot of names your way. Who kind of piques your interest most as Penn State prepares to jump into Big Ten conference play?
I mean, I think you have to start, with Dejan Lane. Franklin went out of his way on Monday to really emphasize that. And that's also been the only name that has come up in that safety spot.
Isn't it really something that, Franklin is notorious for bunching names together or making sure he tacks a second name onto a first name. And multiple times when discussing the safety spot, not even asked directly about Lane, he has brought up Lane and only Lane. I think that's really telling.
Yeah, and I would be curious. Obviously, we're not going to get the chance to talk to Dejan Lane this season, but it would be interesting to know if this is Franklin either challenging him or affirming him. I think that there's always a reason for why Franklin does these things this way, and there's a couple different ways that you can approach that at this point, but that has been really interesting to me. I know that coming into the year, we were lauding the depth that they have at this position, and I think it was really telling that after Winston went out, it was only Wheatley and Reed back there at safety. I would have thought we could have at least seen someone else come in certain points, given how we viewed that group and how it's been talked about, mostly by us. But I am interested in how this comes together now that they've had a week. Okay, maybe these guys, you wouldn't just throw them into the heat of battle against Bowling Green, but now that you've had a week to really work through things and reassess things, talking about moving Belgrave Shorter from corner to safety, maybe then you can come out with a little more flexibility and some different looks. But I think that this is where you want to see someone step up. And talk about the coaching staff. I know Tom Allen most of his salary is probably still coming from Indiana, but this is where you make your money as a defensive coordinator, adjusting. If you're Anthony Poindexter, this is your job to get these guys ready to go. So I'm really curious what it looks like. I think it's going to be different. I know that we talk about Cam Miller moving to that Lion spot, but I think it's been clear when he's been on the field that it's a little bit more of like a traditional nickel as opposed to a 4-2-5 with 3 safeties. I'm not a tape eater or anything, but that's kind of my assessment of things. And so it will be interesting if this means more Dom DeLuca than we've seen these past couple of weeks at that Sam spot. Maybe Tamir Robinson coming back, adding some depth there. Maybe that allows them to move Tony Rojas around or something like that. But it is really interesting. I've said it before on some previous podcasts where it's like you have depth until you don't. And right now, this defense is it pretty quickly. Like you said, 3 weeks into the season, we're in that kind of don't category right now.
During game weeks over at Lions247.com on Fridays, you'll find something I put together called pregame notes. It's a different kind of topical conversation or exploration each week. This time it's going to be about just kind of going through the domino effects of all the defensive departures. And that's going back to spring ball when King Mack hit the portal, ends up at Alabama. We mentioned him earlier. He's got 30 snaps through 3 games with the Crimson Tide. 19 of those came during a 63-0 victory in week 1 over Western Kentucky. And you just wonder what his situation in this defense might look like right now. And what occurred to me as we were discussing this, guys, beyond those big 3 known commodities at safety, which right now is the big 2 in Reed and Wheatley, none of these dudes were in the safety room last year. 3 freshmen, Dinkins, Payne were in the cornerback room, and Tyrese Mills was in the linebacker room last year. I just thought that was quite the situation playing out in Poindexter's room. But we'll learn a lot more about it, we think, over the course of this Kent State matchup, as Penn State's a 49-point favorite. We're going to hit on our score predictions regarding that and a few more predictions for the game later. But let's continue to work our way through the storylines. We've mentioned it a few different times here, but Tamir Robinson was indeed back on the practice field. He was injured on kickoff coverage down in West Virginia in week 1. He was also named the staff special teams player of the week for a couple tackles in coverage down there. But he was sidelined again against Bowling Green. It had been a few practice sessions since we had eyes on him, but he was out there. He was full go. Kind of looked like the normal setup for him as a second teamer with this linebacker unit. And Mark couldn't come at a better time, because you look at where the snaps have gone over the course of the first 2 matchups. Tamir got 1 in that week 1 matchup. He left early, so it's hard to gauge how much he would have played against West Virginia, especially when they went up big. But it's been about 70% of defensive snaps featuring Tony Rojas and Kobe King, who are the starters. About 50% of defensive snaps featuring Dominic DeLuca, team captain, special teams extraordinaire, taking another step in the defense. And then Tyler Elsdon kind of resurfacing in some ways, who is full-time starter in 2022 at the Mike spot. He's played about 25% of defensive snaps. It's really just been a 4-man show. Instantly, though, Tamir Robinson makes it a 5-man conversation, and I'm very curious where he can take his redshirt freshman year, because he was one of the buzzier defensive names going back to spring ball and through preseason camp.
Yeah, I liked at practice, Tyler. He was flying around. Sometimes we see guys come back from injury and they're kind of like last in line, and you can tell they're taking it easy. They were not taking it easy with him. I mean, he was zipping around, and you forget how kind of, I don't want to say he's big, but he's tall. And, 225 pounds, physical. You could see where he could really help them. But going back, I have your snap numbers from the Bowling Green game: 52 for Kobe King, 48 for Rojas, 28 DeLuca, and 13 for Elsdon. So that it further accentuates what you were saying, how you need somebody else. And listen, even if it's not for this game, you know what it's going to be like in the Big Ten. I mean, people are, sooner or later, someone's going to try to run the ball down your throat, and you're going to need
Bielema's coming to town in 9 days. It's
Right.
going to be sooner rather than later.
Yeah, exactly. And you're going to need more depth there. And listen, the other thing, and I always knock on wood, and I know it's a cliche, but we're 2 weeks in, and look at all the injuries that they're dealing with. I mean, God forbid anybody else gets hurt, but you have to prepare for those contingencies. So that's what I think a game like this will be really big for Tamir. Maybe I'm kind of hinting at where I'm going to go with some things later on, but I think it would be ideal if they could get him a ton of snaps in this game, just to get him, just so he has that feel for going in there when a game is actually competitive. And yes, I'm suggesting this game is not going to be competitive. It's not Tyler Calvaruso or Tyler Donahue. It's me.
Yeah, we got some heat for having the audacity to predict a major blowout against Bowling Green as a 35-point favorite. Didn't work out that way. We all know how it went down in Beaver Stadium on September 7th. But forecasting this one, we're going to talk about the potential for younger players to get more playing time a little bit later on this episode. But Daniel, another guy who I think would be very helpful to see him get a lot of snaps under his belt before they jump into Big Ten work is Khalil Dinkins. And I asked James Franklin about him yesterday. We know he's back on the field because he caught a pass last week. He only played about 7 snaps. But James Franklin said exactly what we've been hearing, going back to early preseason camp, points in the summer, where it sounded like he was in the pole position to be the second tight end, even slightly ahead of Rapplier. We figured Rapplier would have his shot to make up some ground. But, Franklin compared him to Tyler Warren in terms of a tight end that's complete, that a defensive coordinator is going to have headaches with, because you can't just say this is a blocking tight end or this is a receiving tight end. You look across college football, you can define a lot of those tight ends like that. Penn State does a nice job of bringing up in receiver kind of types, those kind of athletic bodies, building them up. So with Dinkins, I think I'm leaning towards him maybe getting the start here. I'm not going to maybe call that shot, but wouldn't shock me. What do you think he needs to accomplish in this game? And considering what James Franklin said, calling him a real weapon for them. I think Drew Aller called him a Swiss Army knife for them. Consider me intrigued.
If any Penn State fans are out at their tailgates and they want to make a friendly wager with a friend that they know that they'll win, wager that Penn State will announce 3 wide receivers on the video board, but actually start only 2 and come out with 2 tight ends. That's something that we've seen a lot this year, and dating back to last year, with guys getting announced on the board and then opening in that 12 personnel, 1 running back, 2 tight ends. So I wouldn't be surprised. We saw it the first 2 games of the season with Warren and Rapplier at West Virginia, then Warren and Reynolds against Bowling Green. So if we see Warren and Dinkins against Kent State, that would not surprise me at all to start the game. And then see Khalil Dinkins have a pretty heavy snap share. I'm curious to see where he's at, because Franklin talked about shaking off the rust in that Bowling Green game, a handful of snaps, 1 catch. You have another week, that bye. Now you have another week of practice, and they're going to move him around. I think that was the one thing that stood out about Dinkins's usage last year to me, was that, with how they used him, kind of how they used Brenton Strange, in terms of he's the center of that T. He's lining up in the fullback spot, in the backfield next to the quarterback, moving around, serving as that lead blocker. He's physical. He's developed. I think he's more than showed that he's willing to occupy that role for Penn State. And with Warren being such a good receiving threat and such a good inline blocker at this point, I think that that's where we'll continue to see Dinkins, even if you get Luke Reynolds out there as well. So I'm curious how those pieces of the tight end puzzle fit together. But yeah, I'm expecting to see a decent amount of Dinkins, especially if Penn State is able to open it up a little bit on Kent State. I think he could have a good game, and I think you'll see him used in a lot of different ways.
Be really good for them to get some of that on tape for opponents to have to deal with. And if there's anybody on the field that I can think of that you'd be in a hurry to get to the sideline if this one does get out of hand, it's got to be Tyler Warren. He's played a ton of football. He has dominated the snaps at tight end. He's a very physical player, and you know how important he's going to be to you in Big Ten conference action. So I think it could be a big, busy day for Dinkins and Reynolds too, to that extent. Over at wide receiver, Mark, there's some questions on how much we're going to see certain guys. It's been a lot of Fleming. It's been a lot of Wallace, a lot of Clifford, Omari Evans. But because of what happened with Bowling Green, we didn't get to see a wider rotation of receivers. So there's a couple things in play. It's wait and see mode with Caden Saunders. He's been involved with receiver practices and those drills each of the last couple of weeks. But as James Franklin told us earlier this week, lingering injury issue. That's the reason why he's only been returning punts and not been playing on offense. Is he going to start to emerge? Is that this week? And then notable development, Tyseer Denmark was wearing his own jersey number on the practice field Wednesday evening. The last couple game weeks we've been out there, he was, I think he may have been wearing his own jersey number, but he wasn't with the varsity guys. We see the separation scout team, varsity squad, the guys preparing for the game. There's been 7 receivers in that group. This week, he was one of those 7. So, Mark, beyond the obvious, the guys we've seen involved, who would you like to get a longer look at come Saturday at that position?
Yeah, Caden Saunders. I mean, you asked the question of Franklin, Tyler, and you go to enough of these press conferences and certain things kind of ring a bell, or, I don't want to say set off an alarm because that's too strong of a word, but certain things make your ears perk up a little bit. And you concluded your question, I'm not quoting you here, but by saying we haven't seen a lot of them.
Yeah.
And Franklin replied, we haven't either.
Yeah.
I mean, when a coach says that, I don't want to say he's frustrated, because you have to be real careful with banged up players. But, he's had a lingering injury, and not that he's not able to play, that this is Franklin, but he's not been able to play at 100%. So I think they want to see him too, because by all accounts, he played really well in the spring and in preseason camp. So, yeah, I mean, he had one catch last year. This is a guy came in with a lot of accolades, obviously had to transition his body a little bit. I think he admitted that he was a little, not in the kind of shape that he needed to be, but physically he looks like he's there. So he's the guy. And then Ty Sear, one thing out of practice, I don't know if you guys caught it, but he made an unbelievable catch down in like a goal line situation yesterday. And Grace Brennan, my daughter, our photographer, actually got an unbelievable shot. I've had it as the lead shot of the gallery, but that was actually him making a great, like, diving, lurching stab. So yeah, he's athletic, and we've heard a lot about him, but to see him there kind of with the varsity, I think was a good thing. So the two guys you mentioned are the two guys I'm anxious to see.
Yeah, I'd probably throw Tyler Johnson into the conversation just because he seems to be developing some staying power on the varsity field versus, drifting over to scout team some of these weeks. He's also been involved back-to-back games. But yeah, Caden Saunders would be it for me, because when we talk about getting guys in space and Andy Kotelnicki looking for those weapons, Saunders' name came up a lot this summer. And I know his confidence was on the rise, and confidence is very important for Caden based on, I think, some of the conversations we've had. So you just hope he's able to come through this with the right mindset. By the way, 6 catches, 56 yards, and a touchdown last season as a redshirt freshman. Daniel, let's finish with thoughts. We just mentioned one freshman, Ty Sear, Denmark, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on what you heard about 2 hours ago during a call with Phil Trautwein, offensive line coach for Penn State. Cooper Cousins' name came up a few times, and he did not hold back in his thoughts on the freshman who's played a little bit here and there on the interior through a couple of games.
Yeah, when you talk about Phil Trautwein, you're talking about someone who played for the 2000 Florida Gators, bounced around a couple different NFL teams during his career after that. Someone who at Boston College developed or coached a couple first-round picks, has done more of that here at Penn State. And he got asked the question of, who does Cooper Cousins remind him of, given all of that experience? And that's always an interesting question to see how a coach will handle it, because I feel like a lot of times coaches just do the like everyone's their own unique guy. Like, you don't want to put someone in an air that they might not be able to reach. But Phil Trautwein didn't really hesitate, and he put Cooper Cousins in line with the Pouncey twins, who were offensive linemen at Florida, during the same time that Trautwein was there, and two guys who went on to have really, really long NFL careers. Here is Trautwein's full quote. And he didn't really hesitate before he said this. So you can tell maybe it's something he's been thinking of. He said, quote, "I would put him in the category of the Pounceys. Both of them were great players, but they also had a great mindset. And that's who Cousins, is. He's relentless on the field, loves football. Football is his world. That was the Pounceys. And then he moves well. He's a mauler. Whenever I kind of look at him sometimes, I think about the Pounceys. They were great teammates and great guys. Being able to have two guys that I played with that went first round and played a long time in the NFL, and comparing him to them, that's the kind of player I think Coop is." And so we've talked about this hype train since Cousins got here, even really since before, when we saw him doing this summer work with guys who are older than him. And now that it's here, we're really hearing it. It goes back to what Franklin was saying this summer, going back to what some other guys have said about his work ethic, how he's physically ready. Trautwein also said that Cooper Cousins isn't part of that 5 right now, that top 5 that they're going to put out there, but he expects him to be there soon. I don't know if that means later this season. I don't know if that means right at the beginning of next season, given what Penn State has on the line right now, but there's a lot of pieces on that interior, and Cousins has really seemed like he's made an impression.
Sal Wormley has started 28 straight games at right guard. He's a 6th-year senior. On the other side, I think there's a case to be made for Venga Ioane playing as well as any offensive lineman on this team right now at left guard, and we've seen JB Nelson get work on the interior as well. So it's not a group that's screaming for help right now, but that's me knocking on wood. Injuries happen, and Cooper Cousins is a hell of a backup plan for them right now. But again, in this matchup, Mark, this is where we're going now. Talking about this matchup, it looks like an epic mismatch. I mean, again, just to reiterate, 66-0 at halftime last week down in Knoxville, Tennessee, over this Kent State squad. They lost 2 weeks ago to an FCS foe in and St. Peter's that has not won. I called them the wrong name, didn't I? St. Francis. That's kind of, they haven't won another FCS game this season. They're 0-2 in FCS action, but they've beaten Kent State. The week before that, they lose 55-24 against Pittsburgh. And Mark, collectively, the body of work just doesn't look so good for Kenny Burns, former Indiana running back, former Minnesota assistant. Year 2, 1-14 with this team, carrying 12 straight losses. And now this is the widest point spread we've ever seen in the James Franklin era, going back to 2014. The biggest one before this was a 44-point spread against Delaware last year. They covered that. They're 3-0 with 40-plus point spreads. This is just about 50, Mark. 7 touchdowns. So will it look that way? And if it does, how imperative is it for Penn State to get a lot of their top talent off the field as soon as possible?
Well, first of all, you bailed me out on Caden Saunders on his stats last year. I was looking at scoring, so thank you for doing that. I was hoping I was going to be able to bail you out on St. Peter's, but you bailed yourself out. You know, that the weird thing is St. Francis then promptly lost to Central Connecticut State. Yeah. So I think, and I actually mentioned this in my prediction, I mean, the fact that this team was hammered by Tennessee, you know, losing 65-0 at halftime, and then Tennessee jumps Penn State in the coaches poll. I think it's the impetus is on Penn State to go out and take care of business in this game. I mean, really to roll up as many points, and that's unfortunate, but that's where we are. I think, you know, voters and I think selection committee members are going to be able to look at Tennessee and Penn State and say, have an apples to apples comparison kind of early in the season. And again, it's terrible that it comes at the expense of a program that's rebuilding, but that's just the way it is. And yeah, so I think it's important to come out and play extremely well early, get a big lead early, and then be able to do what you couldn't do against Bowling Green, to get a lot of those younger players, reward some walk-ons, get players work in the second half that haven't had the amount of work that they probably would have liked to have some of these kids have gotten at this point of the season.
We will get into some of those names of the younger components of this roster that we hope to see more of on Saturday. But Daniel, let me throw this your way. In terms of working out the kinks for the first and second teamers, and primarily the guys who are going to be leaned on when this team is playing the Ohio States and USC's of its schedule, what do you think are high on that to-do list on both sides of the ball?
I think on offense, it's going to be difficult, I think, given the state of the Kent State defense, but I think you're going to want to see some sustained drives. You're going to want to see efficiency. You're going to want to see that success on third down. James Franklin has talked about that, where he wants to get more plays. More plays means more touches for more players on offense. And then if you extrapolate that out, that can mean more rest for your defense, keeping them off the field and not putting them in, you know, adverse situations. So I think for the offense, that's the first thing that you want to see. And then defensively, I think you want to see this pass rush show up. That's been something that I think we were really expecting to see early on. I know that both West Virginia and Bowling Green had good game plans in terms of getting the ball out quickly, not letting Abdul Carter, Jani Dennis Sutton really work their way into the backfield, those sorts of things. So I want to see that, whether it is Carter or Dennis Sutton off the edge, whether that's Zane Durant up the middle. I do think that you want to see that pass rush show up. And then overall, Mark just touched on it, you want to see some style points. I think that, you know, I know that James Franklin talks about going 1-0, and that's the most important thing every week. But you know, we've all been around college football for a long time. We know how this works. Like we know what gets taken into account every week. There's so many games. A lot of people just see the final score. And I think that that's the Bowling Green effect. You see 34-27 versus Bowling Green. That raises some eyebrows, you know, versus a 71-0 versus Kent State. You know, Bowling Green could beat Kent State by 80 down the road, but that still wouldn't change how the perception of that. So I think that's the third overall thing that you want to see from Penn State.
And then I think you tack on top of that the penalties. James Franklin would like to see a cleaner approach. They're toward the bottom of conference rankings right now in penalties and penalty yardage per game. That will cost you when it matters most. And it's been a lot of pre-snap and post-play stuff that has kind of rubbed Franklin the wrong way early on. I'm just going to note, it seems like a major mismatch, particularly when it comes to the ground game on both sides. I mean, this is a squad at Kent State that has not been able to run the ball with any effectiveness. They don't have a 100-yard rusher through 3 games. I think they're under 3 yards per carry collectively as a group. They don't have a dynamic playmaker at quarterback. And although he's been around that program a few years, he is not that veteran presence like we saw a couple weeks ago with Bowling Green when you're working with a 6-year senior who's been with the Power 4 conference. So I just don't see a lot of variables here stacking up where it could tip the scales. Of course, we said a lot of similar things before the Bowling Green matchup, and we had to cover that matchup all the way through. But I think, Mark, one other thing that you'd want to see, maybe a cleaner game from the penalties, but also another step forward for Sanders Sahaydak, and just getting you into Big Ten play with more faith than ever in your kicker.
Yeah, I had a chance to talk to him after practice on Wednesday, and there's a video on our front page now. I would encourage people to check it out. The way he handled himself, I mean, I asked him how difficult last year was, and mentioned a lot of players, when you're benched like that, a lot of players will just take off and go look for another opportunity. And I would encourage people to go and look and hear what he had to say in his own words, because I was like, wow. I mean, I was like really impressed. And I didn't even mention the word benched. He's the one who said he was benched. I just said a lot of times guys encounter difficult situations. So I think you can see how he was able to kind of put that behind him and then put missing one against West Virginia this year behind him. But I mentioned it earlier in my post-game stuff. I'm sorry, I was trying to spit it out, that I thought it was important that he was able to convert a couple field goals in a close game. If there was one positive overall for Penn State out of that game being too close, it was that it gave Sander an opportunity to hit 2 field goals and a bunch of extra points, scoring 10 points in a game that's decided by 7. So I think to follow up on that and to just keep being consistent is important. The other thing he said is that first field goal against Bowling Green, he's like, the goalposts were like this. The second one, they were like this. Excuse me for hitting my microphone. So just you can see the confidence kind of brewing, and I think it's important to carry that on.
All right, let's get into some spotlight moments here before we get into our predictions. And we're going to spotlight, again, younger pieces of the puzzle for this Penn State roster that we hope to see more of, with that 49-point spread, what the second half might look like on the field from a personnel perspective. So, Daniel, who are you most curious to see from that group?
I'm going to skip 2 of the more obvious guys that we touched on with Lane and Denmark, and Tyler Johnson as well. But I think I'm interested in Joey Schlaffer, to finally see him on the field. We've heard a lot about his physical development. We've heard about how he was one of those guys that we talked about, that athletic player. I think he played some quarterback in high school, more of a wide receiver, having to come in, put on the weight, and also develop that mindset of, putting guys in the dirt, being a run blocker. He came in with Rapplier, and we've heard so much about Rapplier. Reynolds came in after him. We've heard so much about Reynolds. I want to see what they have further down the depth chart, because you talk about Rapplier being out for a while, Dinkins dealing with some bumps and bruises earlier this year. It's one of those things where that depth disappears pretty quickly. So what do you have down there?
Mark, who are you going here?
I'm going back to Lane. I mean, geez, we haven't seen him yet, but now all of a sudden he's their third safety. I mean, I think you're going to see him get an awful lot of snaps, even if this does become a blowout, just to give him the opportunity to get out there on the field and become, gain that experience. So I know that's an obvious choice, but to me, he's a very important piece of what they're going to do going forward. So there are a couple ways to look at this. You could look at guys we haven't really seen who you think of eventually they might need them, but he's a guy they need now. So I'm anxious to see what he's able to do.
Yeah, all of a sudden seems like an important piece, not just a luxury piece, and a special teamer. I spent so much time before the Bowling Green, and we both did, about the linebackers. Dakari Nelson, Anthony Specca, step on up. It would be good to see them both get some run. So we'll see. Specca's the freshman. He hasn't seen game action yet. Nelson just moved over from safety in August. He's a redshirt freshman. I think the obvious answer on the offensive line is Cooper Cousins, but we spent a lot of time there. I'm not going to go obvious. Javen Williams. What is he bringing to the table right now? I'm really curious. We've only really gotten to look at him, garbage time against West Virginia. He ended up coming in, played left tackle behind Drew Shelton. And then last week we saw Nolan Rucci playing left tackle behind Shelton. He was that swing guy. He was essentially playing the job that Drew Shelton had in 2023 behind Olu Fashanu and Caden Wallace, where whoever was needed and wherever you needed next man up, he was your answer. So seems like Nolan Rucci, the transfer from Wisconsin, is maybe trending in that direction of being your third offensive tackle based on his usage, based on James Franklin's comments. And meanwhile, is Javen Williams trending away from the perimeter? He's getting reps at guard on the practice field. He dominated at guard during his high school career at Wyoming. So what is he? Where is he going to show up on the field? He continues to rep at left tackle when we watch, but does he get work at two positions? And do we get a chance to see what that looks like? Let's not forget, he was a 5-star recruit coming out of school. He's from the state of Pennsylvania. Though unlike Cooper Cousins, who we said he's coming to campus and he will be ready, I think it's always been with Javen Williams. He's coming to campus and then it's going to be an investment. And we'll see what it looks like maybe year 2, maybe year 3. And I think it's imperative because of we've seen Penn State need backup tackles to step up at different points the last couple of seasons. What do you have in Javen Williams? And I think we'll get a chance to maybe find out more about him. Generally, we always go players to watch, and we're going to kind of stick with that one, I think, in most Big Ten games because we're not going to be predicting massive blowouts and talking about younger players. But, Mark, we'll start with you for this one. Who is your player to watch for Penn State?
I'm going to go back to the well that many of us have gone to over and over again and say Cam Wallace. This is going to finally be the game that Cam Wallace, the third back, I think he's going to have a big game. And I'm just going to go ahead and give my bold prediction now because it involves Cam, and I don't want to just repeat myself. But I think Penn State's going to have 2 running backs rush for 100 yards, and one of them is going to be Cam Wallace. So listen, we've heard all about how much this guy has gotten after it in the offseason, patiently kind of waiting his turn, was bumped up last year. We know about the speed. Jaywan Sider telling us about the balance and all these other things that he has. I'm just anxious to see him finally get out there and have an opportunity to break some long runs. And I think against this defense, some long runs may be there. So Cam Wallace is going to be his opportunity. Give him a lot of credit. Can't be easy being behind those 2 backs, but we've mentioned it, knock on wood. You're only ever one play away from somebody getting banged up and him being elevated into one of those positions. So let's see what he's all about.
He did some good things with some late work at West Virginia, and right now he's Quentin Martin, the freshman's trying to work his way into that conversation. But Cam Wallace has been RB3 this season. Daniel, where are you going? Who's your player to watch?
I'm going to go with Cam Miller here on the defensive side of the ball. He's one of those guys that I think is in the category of who knows how long we'll see him, who knows how many snaps he'll get. But I think that he's someone where with the KJ Winston injury, I think his role changes the most. Like, I don't necessarily think his playing time will go dramatically up and down, but how he's used on the field, I think changes given the amount of time that we saw him in the slot. We've heard that he can play well in there. James Franklin highlighted some of those Kent State wide receivers as guys to watch. So I think how Cam Miller holds up playing in that slot, the lion, the nickel, whatever you want to call it. I think that's something I'll have an eye on Saturday.
I'm going to go. I was initially thinking maybe at the top defender in this one, but I'm going to go with someone I think we'll see a lot more in the second half, and that's Beau Pribula. Because I think when he gets his chance to get in there, Andy Kotelnicki ain't going to be essentially taking knees or just saying, hand the ball off to Cam Wallace and let's get out of here. They will want to see what they have in Beau Pribula. They want to see what they have in a lot of this roster if these guys get a chance to go out there with a big lead. And again, there's some motivation to make sure the score looks pretty good to people who aren't going to tune into this game, but ultimately vote on the rankings and all that stuff. So I think that Beau Pribula will get chances to throw the football and down the field and just do things that we haven't necessarily seen him do. How about be the guy who starts a series and finishes the series at quarterback versus coming in for the 3rd play and the 8th play of a possession. So I think this should be a really, really good sample size to gauge where he is as a redshirt sophomore. Don't anticipate, barring anything catastrophic and that knocks out Drew Aller, that we're going to see Beau Pribula for this kind of a run the rest of the way here. So he's my pick here. I'll put the spotlight on him, and we'll see how many snaps he ultimately comes away with. Prediction time now, again, setting it up here, 49-point spread. It is the largest of the James Franklin era. Do we have them covering it? Daniel, why don't you reveal your pick and your bold prediction?
No drama here. Penn State 66, Kent State 6. If they don't cover this one, I just won't make any picks in the non-conference next year, I guess. But yeah, I don't think Penn State should have any problem with Kent State. As for bold prediction, I'm going with at least 3 Penn State players will score their first career touchdowns. And I put together 4 names that I have an eye on. Cam Wallace, who we already talked about, Luke Reynolds, Tysier Denmark, and AJ Harris. Wouldn't be surprised if we get a defensive touchdown. That's calling my shot. And if I want to add a 5th, Tyler Holsworth, I would not underrate there. I don't know if he's on the books anywhere, but I think that he's someone that we could see get some work given what we've seen in the past in these types of games.
If you go 5 for 5 with Holsworth, you can host the post-game podcast by yourself. Just a solo. Okay, that's the deal there. Mark, you already gave us your bold prediction as it relates to Cam Wallace. Where do you come on the score? Are they going to cover?
Yeah, I think they're going to cover. If you didn't pay attention to that Tennessee game, and I was texting you guys during it, hassling you, I actually watched some of it. It was out of some twisted, I don't know what, but I mean that thing was 65-0 at the half. Tennessee offered to have either shorten the game or have a running clock in the second half, and Kent State declined. And Tennessee only scored 6 points in the second half, and Kent State was like, Burns was like, yeah, our guys really stepped up. I think Tennessee showed mercy, right? I mean, they were on their way to scoring 100 points. And I think this is an important game for Penn State early. I mean, I know it's early, and I know it's probably going to be a blowout, but I'm picking Penn State to one-up Tennessee, one-up by 1 point, 72-0, a major blowout. I really do think Penn State's going to score a lot of points. I kind of did that a little tongue-in-cheek with the one-up thing, but I think they're going to blow away the spread in this game.
I also believe that they're going to take care of business, win by more than 49 points. I got it at 63-7. I was tempted to give them the shutout here, but I was a little nervous about what we saw against Bowling Green for that first half, though I think it was a wake-up call. And then when KJ Winston news came through, that was pretty convincing to me that I don't know if I can trust the defense and the personnel and all that stuff to prevent a touchdown maybe later in the game. But I think the offense will score at will. But I will say this now, even if there is a significant injury on the field for Penn State, and you hope there's not, anything short of an absolutely dominant blowout win against this current Kent State team, that will be justifiable in raising some red flags. I don't know where they'll be raised regarding the roster, the coaching staff, or whatever, but that would be a problem. And Daniel, you referenced the Villanova matchup we saw a couple years ago, 2021, when Penn State was kind of cruising. They were in the top 10 by the time they got to October, but that game against Villanova, they could not run the football. And they couldn't run the football the rest of the way, but that was the one that really stuck in your craw a little bit. And so if there are things that pop up here against Kent State, a team that just hasn't had any traction for success in a couple of years now, if that happens in Beaver Stadium after what you got was a wake-up call and after a bye week, that's a pretty significant deal as you jump into Big Ten play. And you maybe have a top 25 Illinois team coming to town the week after. So, guys, appreciate the coverage. We'll be back together in the press box on Saturday. Games at 3:30. We'll be there well ahead. Go over to lions247.com. This is one of those get your binoculars out kind of pre-games for where guys are working and who's in what order. So we will have pre-game notes up throughout, live for you, updates at lions247.com after the matchup. Ton of coverage coming your way. Another post-game podcast. But on behalf of Mark and Daniel, I'm Tyler Donahue. This has been the Lions 24/7 podcast. Thanks for tuning in.